Hello and welcome to the Sardonic podcast, where the only thing stronger than the Infinity Gauntlet is my cripplingly low self-esteem. I'm your host, Elijah Stubbs Roche, and joining me on the panel today, is that a bird? Is that a plane? No, that's sexual tension brought on my panel courtesy of Jake Midas Barger from Green Orcs Gaming. He's a man with 142 skills, none of which is helping him make a living. It's Drew Cheswick Smith.
That's right.
And this is take 3 of the Kill Myself podcast. If you don't know, and you won't because I haven't included and saved any of those previous recordings, I have attempted this podcast 3 times now after an hour of technical difficulties. So if you're willing to listen to it at this stage of my anger and anguish, then my one subscriber is a real swell guy. But today, we're talking about superhero movies and superhero media. And I know you guys are really excited to talk about oversaturation again, so we're going to cut that segment shorter. And we'll just start with Drew, your opinion on the superhero market and its current level of saturation and product.
With most things, if it was as saturated as the superhero movie genre is right now, I would say that it is a huge problem. The thing is, though, is with how the superhero movies in general are, with each one being a different character that you can follow them on their journeys, blah, 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 it allows your average person to pick and choose the movies that they want to watch. That way, they can find that character that they like, that they relate to, whatever, and actually start to enjoy the experience of these characters in the first place. While as those of us who are a little bit deeper into it can spend the time just like we would with comics or anything else and experience them how we want to. So I think in the end, it actually kind of broadcasts itself a little better because of it.
Jake, I'll kick that question off to you real quick. What do you think about the current volume of superhero media?
Well, I think if you focus on any single studio's productions, whether that be DC or Marvel or the Marvel spin-offs due to the licensing issues with 20th Century Fox and the like, if you just take one of those, you have an average of 1 to 2 a year, which is not bad. I would like to see them focus a little more on the quality of some of their movies, i.e. Iron Man 2 and Thor the Dark World, rather than just let's pump them out.
And I think honestly for me, I have a really bad case of burnout with anything in life. Whether it's games, whether it's school, whether it's work. If I do a lot of it at any given time or too much of it at once, I burn myself out. That's just how it is in my life. And superhero movies are burning me out. I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm kind of sick of them. I'm kind of sick of them. My next point here, because I want to get past these first 2 points we've talked about 4 times now, is that I don't really like Marvel movies. I don't like DC movies either, but I don't like DC movies because they're bad movies. I hate Marvel movies because they're Marvel movies. With a Marvel film, I get bored because they're very predictable. There's very little left in the Marvel universe that I think they have the balls to portray. Like I quit my my Marvel obsession with Captain America: Civil War, which wasn't a bad movie. By most accounts, people tell me that's a good movie. I didn't like it. And I didn't like it because I feel like the directors kind of pussed out. Maybe that's unfair of me to phrase it like that, but it just to me felt like you have this concept like Civil War, which in the comic books was this really divisive, really kind of right, wrong, moral, ethical debate that they just kind of said fuck it. They didn't want to make it political and divisive, and that kind of to me misses the whole point of it. And after that, I just kind of started seeing the hallmarks of scared to make a not commercially successful movie or a potentially commercially unsuccessful movie from Marvel, and it got boring very quickly. And by the way, I'm aware Deadpool exists, but that is still a 21st Century Fox movie. So, we'll move on to that. What I do want to ask you, though, is that just because I'm a twat and hate Marvel movies doesn't mean that you guys do. And I want to hear from you, Jake, first. What is it that you enjoy about Marvel movies?
Well, I gotta say, the reason I keep going back is largely because my friends really enjoy the movies, and I like to be a part of that. But what I enjoy personally and keep going back to the movies are with Marvel specifically is the characters, and that's kind of cheating because they haven't developed the characters that well. But I still get to see them develop further on screen and even their subsequent titles than I get with a movie like Batman versus Superman, where it's all dialogue and no real development with a 10-minute fight scene at the end.
And Jake, or not Jake, Drew. Boy, we've really been hammering away this podcast for like an hour now. You can see it's working on me. Drew, I'll kick the question up to you. What is it? What draws you to Marvel and its media outside of comic books?
Well, originally it was because of Iron Man. I'm a huge techie guy in the first place, and Iron Man is the tech superhero, basically. You know, if there's going to be any superhero that's tech, it's that one. And it just kind of stuck with me. I liked how all of the movies were definitely in the same universe as long as they were the Marvel Studios ones. And so it was this really nice expanding universe, while with more of the DC side, they had this wonderful The Dark Knight trilogy. And instead of using maybe that Batman, like when they did Batman versus Superman, they started with a brand new one. And when they started with him, he had no backstory up to that point, and they had this new Superman. And so you really didn't get to learn who exactly that specific character was, in my opinion. I'm sure that others have differing opinions in the first place. But to me, also, Marvel has just more relatable characters, while DC is more of the superimposed characters where they're meant to be so much larger than the rest of the world. So
I cannot relate to Marvel characters in any capacity. I that was one of those weird things. Just like you brought it up, and I thought, wait, what? I think this is gonna. I'm gonna skip my next talking point because it's just gonna become me fangasming about the Dark Knight. Uh, to bring this up because this is something that I think should be brought up. I don't know if I like the idea of superheroes being relatable. I I think that it's kind of unhealthy. I don't think that you should be comparing yourself to superheroes or being related or relating your struggles and things to superheroes because superheroes have fantasy powers. They do things that people can't do, and none of them are good at coping with their problems. They're all actually pretty bad people outside of like the superhero persona. Like they're shitty at the game of life, even if they're good at fighting crime. And this is something that I actually like. It's something that as I've grown older, I've come to kind of have this opinion. But I loved Batman. I still do actually. I have a weakness for Batman. Like my whole life, I was. But as I've kind of gotten older, I realized Batman is not the kind of man I want to be. I'd love to be the strongest, smartest guy in the world, but like Batman himself isn't a person who I want to relate to because he is just so bad at the act of just living life as a human, and that's something that I think is very true with superheroes. I think this is something that like the romanticizing that things like Marvel and DC, they both do it, bring to this kind of like superhero persona. I don't know if that's like a healthy or good thing. And Jake, I want to kick this question to you. I mean, what do you think about that? That this idea that people do kind of idolize these characters.
Well, I have never thought of it that way. I think that's a very interesting point. Um, I would agree in a small point that comparing yourself and even just trying to relate to people who you cannot ever hope to match in reality would be unhealthy. But I also think that's just not why people watch movies. And when people say relatable, they less mean an actual direct correlation between themselves and the character and more of a spiritual link, such as Captain America being a nice guy who's essentially a 100-year-old virgin. I believe a lot of people can relate to that.
I don't have an argument for that because you are very correct with that statement, but I guess I'll kick it to Drew next. I want to hear about what do you think of I guess superhero culture in this, I guess like idolization, almost deification that people give to superheroes.
First of all, I don't know what you're talking about. Alcoholism is definitely a valid coping mechanism.
Hmm.
But I have to agree with Jake. It's not necessarily the, okay, I want to be this person or anything like that. It's the small parts that we take from the different characters that I think make them more or less relatable. Which is, that makes us as humans like something more or less. It's hard coded into us. When, we talk about Spider-Man being, relatable, we're probably not necessarily saying, I feel like I can lift a car and climb a wall and swing off a building or jump off it and not die. I think we're more saying, I'm a little snarky, I'm a little smart, I'm a little nerdy, but deep down I am a good guy, or something to that degree. I don't think it necessarily has to be a 100% to scale relation.
So then let me push this one out then. If we were to take superpowers out of the equation, if you say where Peter Parker lived out life the way that he had, and then we take away the Spider-Man aspect of it, is Peter Parker the kind of character that a person could look up to and idolize in his coping mechanisms? And I realize Peter Parker's a really bad example because he actually is really good compared to the rest of the cinematic universe. But I hope I got my point across with that question. And I'll ask Jake that one.
Well, if we're using Spider-Man as an example,
Yeah, that was a bad example.
For starters, he does start out as a student, so that could be something to do with the relatability. Just a young guy in school. But for people who haven't expanded their Spider-Man knowledge tools with the likes of comics and TV shows, he does do a better job than most of the Marvel universe at dealing with his issues. After all, he's not an alcoholic like Tony Stark tends to go into when he's depressed, and he can actually admit when he's wrong, unlike most of the Avengers. So I'd say Spider-Man, yes. Most of the rest of them, no, we don't look up to.
But that's the thing, though, is that you kind of attach these huge character flaws onto superheroes, onto these saves the day characters. And I guess I'll loop back to Batman because he's the one that I know the best. Batman is the smartest guy in the world. He's the best fighter without supernatural powers in the world. He's great at all these things, but you dig into his life, and his coping mechanism for his dead parents is vigilantism, crime fighting, and his ability of handling like his family, his adopted family, and his biological family is kind of shitty. Like, they've all come to hate him because of it. Even Dick Grayson says, "I don't want to be Batman. It's a hollow, empty life." And I don't know, it's that idea that you just attach something like that, but then put the spotlight on, the positive, the superpowers, the kick-ass aspects of Batman. That I guess just kind of rubs me the wrong way. I guess I'll break into the next topic before I spend my entire time allotment on this one. But there was a DC movie, and these are that I wanted to bring up. It was The Dark Knight, not the whole trilogy, just that one movie. Because while the other two movies are pretty good, I think that the middle one is kind of the magnum opus of the trilogy. I've hoped that you two have both seen The Dark.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I wanted to bring it up because it goes back to what I talked about earlier, which is that I felt like superhero movies don't have the balls to let characters kind of be as dark, I guess, as they feel is commercially acceptable. With all these technical difficulties, I feel like they'll release Infinity Wars 2 by the time I finish recording this. So, getting back to my topic at hand, we were talking about, I guess, how The Dark Knight kind of let characters like the Joker run rampant in a way other characters or other movies may not let their villains do. And I want to ask you guys about different movies in the superhero genre. Mine is The Dark Knight. I think that's kind of like the magnum opus of superhero movies with, depth and villains and, heroes that are even interesting. But, what are the big standouts for you guys? Start off with Drew here.
Well, now I have to put it as Infinity War. Luckily, Elijah's already called out that there are spoilers, so I can't get in trouble for this one.
Did I actually call out spoilers on this take of it?
Okay, well, there's spoilers.
Let's call it out on this. I've had to take this thing. This is our third take, man. I'm sorry. This is where it's difficult to know what I've said because I've said so many things 3 times now. But yeah, spoilers for Infinity Wars after this point.
All right, 3, 2, 1. You've been warned. All right, with the fact that they killed so many people in Infinity Wars. I don't know the exact count, but there's only one person left in the whole Guardians of the Galaxy. I think they're down to maybe 20% of the Avengers, and the number just kept getting smaller and smaller. The fact they killed them off, and it felt like this is a finale. At the very beginning of the movie, when Loki dies, they flat out say there is no coming back. They are full bore.
Do you think Infinity War was just like their way of like offering all the actors an out on their contract?
I don't think so. No, I'm 90% sure that they're coming back in the next movie. But at this point,
dude, Dragon
they
Balls,
killed
man.
off. Yeah, exactly. The Shenron theory. Everyone's gonna come back, but they had the balls to do what they couldn't do in Civil War. They killed people off. They couldn't touch on the rest of the actual meat of the story in Civil War, but at least in this, they got dark.
I really, really hate to burst your bubble there, Tiger, but that's not how the story ended. And that's not how they're going to proceed at all. Sorry to cut you off there, Eli, but if you and anyone who's read the Infinity Gauntlet series of Marvel knows this, but almost every character who died in Infinity War is going to come back. There's a term Marvel people like to say called Bucky dead, because for a long time Bucky was the only character who stayed dead, and then they fucked that up when they brought Bucky back. So now the only character who stays dead is Uncle Ben. So now we got to say Uncle Ben dead. But no, the only people I think who died in Infinity War who are going to stay Uncle Ben dead were Loki and Heimdall and the rest of the Asgardians, because everyone who got, I guess you would say, snapped out of existence by the gauntlet itself, they're going to come back in the sequel in some fashion, whether they stick it close to the comics where Nebula got the gauntlet and brought everybody back, or whether they go a different direction is up for debate at the moment and interpretation. But it's not that dark, because we know what's going to happen and we know it's going to end well for them, because that's how every Marvel movie goes.
And I know that they are going to come back. It is the fact, though, that they killed them at this point.
Well, they didn't really kill them either. They just kind of said, they just kind of were like generic disappearing act.
They were
They
memed
poofed.
out of existence.
Yeah, even Vision, they literally ripped that stone out of his forehead and destroyed him. If you read the comics, he just gets a new body. They just reprogram him.
So, what I want to then approach this is because one of the things I said about Civil War in one of my many takes of this podcast had to do with the fact that I thought it was dark and kind of ballsy. It's not dark because they killed characters. Something's not dark just because you kill a bunch of people. In fact, I'm gonna bring out some old quotes. Mr. Monte Cristo, lead caster, talked about this once. Titus Andronicus is a really old Shakespearean play. It's Shakespeare's first tragedy, and it reads like a pile of garbage, where just everyone dies. It's just what happens in Titus Andronicus. People just die. They kill everybody. The characters you feel sorry for, the bad guys, the main character, they just die. They die over the course of the book. And it's what it teaches people when you're like studying literature and history is that just because you killed a bunch of people doesn't make something dark. I think Civil War is dark because, or maybe I guess just advanced reading, maybe not necessarily dark, because in the original comic spread, it was a really kind of political, like socio-political analysis of the idea of superheroes in a culture that's based off real-life culture. What happens when superheroes fail? What happens when they're a liability? Do they need to be controlled? And these characters fighting was about idealism. It was about, these kind of intangible concepts. And those things are what made it very good reading. And sometimes even very dark, because sometimes they would do terrible things in the name of those ideals. I feel like Thanos just proving that he's a badass, snapping his fingers and killing like 80% of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, doesn't have the same impact to me. That feels more along the lines of something that's just like easy outs on contracts. And I'm giving Marvel a really bad rap with my shitting on this. But I don't hate Marvel. I hate Marvel movies. But Jake, we were talking about the best movies in the superhero genre before we got in these tangents, and I want to ask you what your standout in the genre is, in your opinion.
I feel like this is kind of gonna put me in a certain group of people, but if I start back from my childhood, so basically every movie that I've ever seen with the superhero genre, my personal favorite was probably Guardians of the Galaxy. The things I liked about it were kind of the fact that we had this group of misfit heroes rather than perfect people, and they did the right thing even if it wasn't for the right reasons or they didn't go about it the right way.
But very succinct. I actually enjoyed Guardians of the Galaxy too, I guess. And by that I mean the first movie, not the second movie. I didn't see the second movie.
The second movie was also pretty good.
I've been told that, and I feel like I should watch it because I like the first movie. But I just, like I said, Marvel has burned me out, as I'm sure I've probably said in one of my 5 takes of this. But what I want to ask you, I want to bring up, since we're on topic of Marvel movies right now, is Deadpool. This movie kind of stands out, not just because it is a rated R film that did amazingly well. It's pretty different as far as a superhero film is concerned. There's a lot of fuck involved in that movie, not just the word fuck, but also some pretty good fucky, and also violence. It's kind of a weird take on violence. It's a lot of comedy violence, but still very violent. I don't know, it's so horribly offensive to the sensibilities of normal people, and yet it's just so great because it's a superhero film at the same time. And I think everyone knows the statistics, but if you don't, I'll recite them here. It was the #1 performing rated R movie during its opening weekend ever. And I want to ask you two, what do you think draws Deadpool, or draws audiences to Deadpool? And I'll start this one off with Drew.
I think that part of what makes it work, what brings so many people to it, is the fact that it is it's a counterculture. It makes fun of everything that people like with our current culture. It makes fun of things. It doesn't mind killing people and making fun of death, where as a people we tend to make it a sad thing. It's a nice step away and break from the reality, and it's just funny. I think that's all it honestly needed. It needed that breath of fresh air from life.
Jake, what about you? What is it that you think draws people to the old pool?
I want to preface this by saying I am a huge Deadpool fan in every medium, the movie, the games, the comics, whatever you say that. I love Deadpool in every way, but at its core, Deadpool is just a comedy movie set in a spoof of a superhero movie. It in and of itself is not as special as people make it out to believe, because it's a joke rather than an original idea. It's not doing anything new. It's just setting those things in a different environment. That being said, what people love about it is exactly what you're supposed to love about it. It's funny. It's mostly comedic. It's also a character people have come to associate with these things, so they know it's going to be funny. And people just want to be entertained, so what better way than to make a movie that entertains? That's just what it is. Doesn't take itself seriously.
I think that the big thing with Deadpool, at least for me, is there's two things I think kind of stand out to me for this film. The first big one, obviously, being its kind of the passion project aspect of it. Ryan Reynolds is really dedicated to this character. Like, he really loves playing Deadpool. You can just tell. He just exudes this I love this character persona whenever he's on screen. I looked at the background of it and found out that, yeah, actually, this is kind of his passion project. He's worked on it for many years, and it shows. It shows. He has that kind of, like, zeal that, like, Tommy Wiseau has in The Room, where, like, even though he's bad, you can just feel that he's really trying his hardest. The difference being is that whereas The Room's a terrible movie, Deadpool is a movie with a budget and a great staff that all love the source material. And then the second thing is that I think it's one of the few comic book movies that both kind of appeals to non-comic book fans and also comic book fans, because Deadpool, it's actually a really good representation of the character. Probably one of the best representations of a superhero in a movie. If we're just going to talk about kind of a one-for-one trade, it's a really good representation of Deadpool. And I think that I want to move to something that kind of ties into that topic, which is source material. We've kind of brushed on the topic using a few different movies, but we've kind of seen characters and movies live and die by some pretty bad representations. I think what here's a good one. This is the one I think is pretty classic in this genre. Is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Those movies always seem to have to put their origin story in there, and it's always different, it feels like. And I want to talk about source material in movies. How much of the source material needs to be followed with reverence? How much of it can be discarded? What concepts do you need to keep? And I think I'm going to kick this one off to Jake first.
I think as far as source material goes, it's important to at least understand what the characters are, not necessarily their origin stories, whatnot. I think it's more important to have your own writing match up with itself rather than the source material. But I think the source material also can set movies up for failure because it doesn't translate as well to the screen. For instance, The Incredible Hulk is a great series to read, but it's hard to get that constant struggle of dealing with your inner demons and your depression, being rejected. It doesn't translate well into a 2-hour movie. So you have to be creative enough to work around that, but not alienate your already current fans by completely dismissing it.
You know what I think is actually a really good example of what you just said is Spider-Man 3, which is pretty infamous, and I know bringing it up here in my Marvel bashing is probably poor form. That's me going for the kidney shot right there. I think Marvel wants to disown that movie. But I think what you said there is something that's very true in that movie, is that in the comic books, in the source material, Peter Parker's struggle with the symbiote is very intrinsic. It's a lot more in his head than it is on the outside. But you can't do that in a movie necessarily. It's difficult to create these kind of inner monologues. And it's and so you have to show it externally. And that's what I think causes so many people to see Spider-Man 3 and just, I guess, wonder how Sam Raimi got a career. I'm even left speechless thinking about Spider-Man 3. You can tell with my stuttering. But Drew, I want to kick it to you about source material. How much of it should be followed? How much of it shouldn't be?
This is something that I've actually kind of evolved as a person with the release of a recent movie, not superhero, Ghost in the Shell, where they took the basic idea and they changed some stuff. They didn't follow the exact same storyline, anything like that. But in my opinion, and while I know I'm part of the minority on this one, I felt like it worked. I think that in the end, what you need in order to not have to follow the source material is to just not betray what the ideal what the idea is, not the ideal, the idea, such as Civil War, which I think we've kind of already bashed on a little bit. The fact that they took it from this epic of, what do you as a reader believe and who are you going to side with, and turned it into a slapping match between Captain America and Iron Man. They didn't keep the same idea. They simplified everything, and in the end, it didn't work. They, as you said, they weren't willing to put themselves out there to make it true to the source material. It's not necessary, but it's also not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, me and you are sitting at a lonely table for two when it comes to talking about Ghost in the Shell. Because, yeah, while I didn't think it was some sort of epic masterpiece, it was still something that was clearly made by people who had seen more than one episode of the show. But yeah, and talking about source material is kind of... It's a weird balancing act because, like Jake said, there is source material that's more set up to fail you than it is to succeed. And then there are times where, you betray the idea of a character or a story arc and it comes back to bite you. And I think those are great points to bring up. Fantastic things to say. Because I feel like Marvel's a little all over the place. DC, I don't think they've even read the source material for the things. I think they just copy the visual aesthetics. It's something that I think a lot of people bitch about with Batman versus Superman. Is that it's this hour and a half long drama that leads up to an 8-minute fight sequence, which, by the way, is still 1 minute longer than any fight that Batman and Superman have ever had. So congrats, Batman vs. Superman, outperforming everybody else. But that movie, if you didn't know, copied a lot of shit from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, which is a great comic, and it's a great animated movie. I highly recommend checking it out. And it lost its meaning when they put it in Batman vs. Superman. And it goes back to the Civil War argument that we were talking about. It's that Batman and Superman fighting shouldn't be just some misunderstanding or manipulation from an antagonist. Batman and Superman are different. They've always had differences. And Batman versus Superman should be about those differences. But of course, they skipped all the lead up to it, which is the problem. Now that I'm on topic of DC movies, I want to talk about the next thing on my session notes, which is the Superman paradox. I don't think that's a real name. I made up that name because it sounded cool and my session notes needed something as a headliner. But I get this comment a lot when I tell people I'm a DC fan, which is, Superman's just invincible. How is it fun to watch him do anything? And, it brings up this question of, what does strength mean in the context of a superhero? And that's changed for me. When I was a kid, watching a good guy beat up a bad guy was where all that was at. Dude, watching Batman kick the shit out of Bane, that's cool. But now that I'm an adult, the best part of Batman is not when he kicks somebody's ass or when he's being really smart. It's in his humanizing moments where, like, the cold exterior breaks down and he shows some humanity to people. And I found that Superman has kind of been the same way with me. He's a much more interesting character now that I'm an adult because his struggle is internal. You know, he's too strong. You're damn right. He's so strong he could take over the entire world and wipe crime off the face of the map. Why doesn't he? And more importantly, what's stopping him from doing it? It's himself. We're not certainly going to do it. I want to kind of bring that up to you is that what does strength mean in the context of being a superhero? Is it just beating bad guys, or is there something more to it from our perspective as a reader? And I guess I'll throw this question up to, let's flip a coin. All right, Drew.
All right. Well, I'm actually going to say that while for the most part I don't like DC characters, because they all are that too perfect stereotype. While Batman has a little bit of his sanity at questionable times, or it is questionable at times, and Superman he's too perfect, cannot do wrong, always is there, blah, 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 blah. I think that my favorite interpretation of Superman actually was in the Injustice games, where he snaps and he decides to just do things his way. And personally, I find that as more of an enjoyable character. I find that him having those, while he's not human, those human moments, those things that make them relatable to us, they really help that character become stronger in our opinions, in our minds. Whereas with almost the entire DC universe, they're nigh infallible. They cannot do wrong. They're always going to be on the side of right, and that right is never really questionable. And that's where my opinions kind of lie on that one.
So I'll throw this one to you, Jake. What does it mean? When a superhero is strong, is it just when he's kicking ass, or is there more to it than that?
I don't want to bring too much idealism into it because I personally watch hero movies and play the games for the entertainment factor. The ideals don't really apply to me as much as the average person. But the difference between just going out and beating up the bad guys, which is very much an old and thrown out idea in almost all mediums of superhero culture, you don't even see it that much in the newer cartoons such as Justice League Action. It really makes you wonder
why there's still crime in half these cities.
Yeah, the superhero or the Superman paradox, as you put it, is the reason I don't care much for watching Superman standalone. Because there isn't a lot of threat of him losing, threat of anything going wrong a lot of the time. Even if you have other parts of the story that are great, I don't want to watch the indestructible man fight the bald guy with lots of money. It's not as good of a premise. And a lot of what Cheswick said is true. That is kind of a DC flaw. The premises are weak, just good guy versus bad guy, not as much story. That being said, there are great DC stories. The animated universe that's been going on the last few years has actually really intrigued me and been quite entertaining. For instance, the Judas Contract is a Teen Titans movie, and it was actually very disturbing, a lot of it, but it also shows that DC is and can be as dark and as storytellingly rich as Marvel. So there's that. But Superman's just not as fun by himself.
So that moves me on to a very important premise here with The Watchmen. So Watchmen's a DC comic. If you haven't seen the movie, the fuck are you doing with your life? Go out and see that movie right now. It is not your average superhero movie, and not in the way Deadpool is funny. Watchmen is really socio-political commentary. It's dark to a fault, some might even say. Very disturbing in some ways, even, I've been told. Because it is really a reflection of, society and heroes. And it brings up a very interesting point because Watchmen has its own Superman, Dr. Manhattan, who is way stronger than Superman, by the way. Let's get that very clear here. If Superman is godlike, Dr. Manhattan is pretty much God. What I kind of want to talk about with DC characters, and a lot of them, I got this message from both of you, which is that they don't seem as dynamic or humanizing sometimes because they feel larger than life. That is actually the exact opposite feeling I get, because I guess I'm a bigger DC fan. I have more depth into it. But I've been following like Dark Knight Metal, which is literally an entire story about Batman's fears and insecurities becoming alternate dimensions, which spawn evil Batmans, which is crazy to think about. There is this sense that a lot of these characters are too strong in the face of their villains, but I feel like the characters are less about that. I feel like Marvel defines themselves with it, whereas DC really has this semblance of character conflict being more important than, I guess, action sequences. But Watchmen was a great example of what I was talking about, which is just a piece of superhero work really offering real-life socio-political analysis, because in Watchmen you have Rorschach. I think that he's kind of the standout character here. He's this man who believes that justice is black and white, that there is only right and wrong, there's nothing in between. And this whole movie dissects that idea of right and wrong, and what's correct, what's wrong, what's the right thing to do, and that sometimes the right thing to do involves doing some very terrible things. I'm going to spoil the ending for you right now, so if you two haven't seen it, plug your ears. Or just plug your ears because you hate the sound of my voice. But at the very end, Rorschach is told that the best thing for humanity is going to kill a lot of people. And he can't accept that. He can't live in a world where the right thing is also pretty bad. And then he turns into a bloodstain in Antarctica. It's dark, not for the faint of heart. But I want to bring up this idea that, do we think that maybe that's the direct, or I guess what I want to say, may phrase it differently here. Is that how superheroes should be portrayed, as just always a force of good versus a force of evil? Because in a lot of superhero movies, good and bad is very black and white. But that's not how real life works. There's always a lot of gray area. And I want to address this in the superhero things right now. Is it maybe painting things more black and white than it should be? And I'll kick this one off to Jake first.
Well, firstly, yes, it is painting things very strangely, as the real world is not black and white. However, when it comes to right and wrong in the Watchmen universe, Rorschach can't accept where anything that is evil should go unpunished. He's the ultimate champion of justice, where to the point where his famous line of "never compromise even in the face of Armageddon" really means more than just "I'm not going to stand for this." It shows who he is as a person because of his traumatic past and his encounters with the underworld of humanity as Rorschach.
So then, can I throw you another question real fast?
Yeah.
Is he right? Is that the right mentality to have? Is never compromise even in the face of Armageddon appropriate?
No. It is. Rorschach is one end of the spectrum as far as superheroes go, whereas I feel like the other end is your Dr. Manhattan. You, on the one hand, you have a character who is almost quite literally God. I believe in the DC universe, he is ranked in the top 5 most powerful characters that I can think of, at least. Everyone is weaker than the Presence, and there's the DC's. Everyone's weaker than the Presence because the Presence is literally God. So that's the only exception I can think of off the top of my head, who would be stronger than Dr. Manhattan. But that's kind of a cop-out because it's literally God. And then there's the other end of the spectrum. You have the normal guy who was willing to stare down this literal God of a being and say, "You're wrong. You're the problem. This is not okay." So it's this war of ideologies, absolute justice versus absolute power. And that was more the point of Watchmen than anything.
And that's something that I always really liked about Watchmen. It was just very, very dynamic like that. And I guess I'll kick the question now to you, Drew. How do you feel about that idea of when superhero films paint things very black and white, right and wrong, are two very extremely different things?
The problem with this question is that it's a per person thing. As far as I see it, I personally am a little bit more black and white. But I know that other people, it's very much there is that gray area of a good thing. For just an example, the new Avengers movie, Infinity War. Thanos is only kind of a bad guy. The way how he words the reason why he's doing everything in the movie, because I have not read the books, but the way how he words it is that he was part of a planet where resources were becoming scarce, and when he proposed his original plan to kill off half of the population or whatever, he was shot down, and in the end, the planet failed. He's not really a bad guy in that aspect because his long-term goal is the preservation of life in the universe. Is it a flawed goal? Yes, it is. But that brings into the fact there is that spectrum. I think that it's a necessary viewpoint to have people who look on both sides of the spectrum. And I think that's part of what made Watchmen the masterpiece that it really was, that you had the crazy character. I can't.
Dr.
think-
Manhattan.
No.
Rorschach? Rorschach's the one in the mask. Are you talking about the bad
Rorschach,
guy?
yes. No, Rorschach, actually.
Okay, Rorschach.
You have the crazy character, because he is slightly insane, Rorschach, who will not budge, he will not give an inch, and we need those people. That's definitely a part of the human equation. But at the same time, you have the villain-ish, in this case, who understands also the need of doing something that would be highly unpopular in order for the greater good. I think that really does, having both of those two views, not just one or the other, really does help to make the story great.
And they never portray either one as right or wrong. That's something that I think is really good about it too. Is that Rorschach is never explicitly shown as wrong. And I, for the life of me, can't remember who the antagonist's name is off the top of my head. He was the blonde man. His view is not explicitly shown as wrong either. Thank you, tech team, for finding me the name of that person, by the way.
Ozymandias.
Ozymandias, yes. I think that Ozymandias, his opinion was never explicitly shown as wrong either, and Rorschach's was never shown as wrong. But they were shown to both be flawed. That people would suffer. In Rorschach's case, because he's not perfect in his ability to determine what's right and wrong. And in Ozymandias' case, because he was going to kill tons of people to unite the rest of them. And then, of course, pin all the blame on Dr. Manhattan. Those are really great things. And while I could sit here and gush about Watchmen, I am kind of broaching my limit of what I want to discuss on the topic. I do want to bring up one more superhero movie, and this one is kind of more topical in my opinion. V for Vendetta. This movie came up as actually a talking point that I was discussing, I think, with my dad the other day, was about superhero movies. This is a movie that's kind of almost freaky to watch nowadays, because there's a lot of culture shock when I watch this movie, because so many of the things that occur in V for Vendetta are kind of systematically occurring around me in real life. Now that's social political commentary right there at its finest. Have you two seen V for Vendetta?
Absolutely.
I have never seen V for Vendetta, but I understand the general premise of it and have at least seen parts of it.
Okay, so then you might have something to contribute here. But the thing about V for Vendetta is, and I'm a spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen multiple-year-old movie now. In V for Vendetta, you get V, who is this, I guess domestic terrorist would be the correct terminology if you want to be official, but is kind of portrayed as the hero of the story in a very dystopian Britain where control of the government has been given over to tyrannical dictators, individuals who are quite literally at this point thought policing people, searching for them based off what they say, spying on their personal conversations. And the point that V brings up in the very beginning of the movie is how Britain has traded its freedom for safety, but wound up with neither. And what's very interesting is he doesn't blame the tyrannical government. He says that there are people there who are responsible and they'll be dealt with in time, but the real culprit behind everything was you. Was all of you people here in Britain. You're the ones who sold your soul to the devil. And that was very powerful. And that's mostly because I live in modern day where it seems like people are very willing to kind of sign away their freedoms for safety and then not really get the safety they were promised. It's a very topical political discussion. And I'm breaking my number one rule of all time, which is don't discuss politics with people that you never want to talk to again. But I kind of want to bring this one up because this movie is really old. Very ahead of its time. Drew, I'll kick it off to you because you've actually seen the movie. What was your thoughts on V for Vendetta? And if you watched it more recently, what your belief on what I just said was?
Well, first of all, I make sure that I watch it every year in November. And secondly, the quote that you mentioned is actually based off of a Benjamin Franklin quote. And it goes, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety."
Yeah, but V has so much more eloquence when he speaks it, I must say.
Yeah, but this is also a 300-year-old quote. Correct. Anyways, I think that the nice thing about V for Vendetta is it make people think, is it worth it to trade these arts, this history, everything for false security? Is it really security if you have to worry at all times about your personal safety because of what you thought or felt or believed at any given point in time? It is how it counters itself. The movie did an amazing job. And one thing I would also like to point out is that V for Vendetta also had a little bit of counterpoint to its main character. If you remember in the movie, and spoilers out the wazoo, for those of you who haven't watched a over decade old movie, actually I think it's closer to 20 years old at this point, movie, but the main character was actually tortured and all of this stuff. So for him, it actually became revenge than it about the ideal in order his purpose. And that's where V for Vendetta really shined, in my opinion. It's because someone's doing something good, but not necessarily for the right reasons. Is that inherently bad? Or is that all right? Just like we were talking with The Watchmen and Infinity War. It really works its way into making you as a person think about how you feel about it. Granted, with V for Vendetta and of course Infinity War, they kind of push you in the direction that they want you to feel in a way. How V for Vendetta is very much libertarian, almost anarchy, and Infinity War being safety is more important than the greater good, I guess. These are the things that just work. Everyone's going to find their own answer to any question that's asked to them as far as the politics revolving, especially V for Vendetta. And I think that's amazing.
And I agree with you. I think that one of the things about V for Vendetta that makes it stand out was, in fact, that they did wrap up this libertarian kind of political message inside of a character with very personal motivations. V is out for revenge. And that can sometimes muddy his appeal as a character, because now you know that it's not all about doing the right thing. You know that there's personal parts to it. And one of the things I think I would like to ask you, Jake, is that relationship between, personal vendettas or personal reasons that maybe aren't heroic and the right thing. What supersedes the other?
Well, for purposes of storytelling, I actually prefer the personal vendetta. But as far as the whole idea in superhero medium, the idea is kind of supposed to be about doing the right thing rather than anything else. That's the point of a whole swath of superheroes, and actually the core reason behind your Civil War type conflicts is doing the right thing, as opposed to the popular idea or the status quo.
There's one more topic I kind of want to brush on, but I have to be much quicker about it because we have absorbed quite a bit of time here. As that was the DC animated films, because you brought them up earlier, Jake, and I think that they are worth mentioning here. Because it's animation, I think that it gets a lot worse of a reputation. Like, the standards we hold it to are much higher. Because I think the animation still has this stigma around it about being a kid's medium. Like, this is what children watch, which means they clearly have never seen hentai before. But that was something I kind of want to bring up, because there are a lot of DC animated movies that are not for kids. You cannot justify them being shown to kids. Like Frank Miller's The Dark Knight, Dark Knight Returns. I almost said Dark Knight Rises. That was terrible. Jeswick, have you seen The Dark Knight Returns?
I have not.
And Jake, what about you?
I have.
So then you have the context to speak on this. Is that a kids animation? Is that what you'd show to kids?
If I had to give it a movie rating, I would definitely. I wouldn't rate it R by any stretch of the words, but I'd definitely put it as a PG-13 movie. Although I do think it is really more appropriate for young adults rather than children.
There's a scene in The Dark Knight Rises where the Joker has a batarang sticking out of his eye, and then he snaps his own neck, right?
Yes, I'm well aware of this scene.
You'd still give it the PG-13 with that in there?
I know the ratings people would not give it a PG-13, but
I guess that's a twisted question nowadays, though.
Yeah, I don't feel like it deserves that R rating.
Fair
but
enough.
it would itself get an R rating.
But the thing I wanted to bring up with these animated films is that obviously they carry this stigma of being kids' movies, even when they're very much not. And I think that really kind of undermines the quality of some of these films. Even the ones that are meant for kids. Things like the Batman Mask of the Phantasm, made by the same studio that made Batman the Animated Series. Meant for kids, but still wonderful movie. Fantastically made. And then also things like Dark Knight Returns, which is not a kid movie. It is an animation, and it's kind of never been able to escape that stigma. And so, Drew, I'll throw up a more general question to you, since you haven't seen the movie. How do you feel about that concept that just because something fits in the zeitgeist of being a kids movie, that it's kind of given lower priorities, or maybe just like a lower appreciation, despite having an equal amount or sometimes potentially even a greater amount of quality from its live action counterparts?
I personally feel like the fact that animation is basically stigmatized as a media for younger kids is wrong in the first place. We can have, if it's CG, we can have these definitely not child movies in things like Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, or whatever. But as soon as it becomes a hand-drawn thing, people automatically assume that it is meant for kids. I personally think that it is one of the greatest devices, especially in comic book characters, as a storytelling device, because you can do things in it that cannot be done in live action. You can have those inner monologues like Jake was talking earlier with the Hulk, or you can have effects that just would not happen. You can also more easily show more gruesome scenes that just work better as a cartoon because you can show a little bit more detail, which helps to get that whole point across in the first place. A lot of the DC animated movies that I have seen have been absolutely wonderful. The Court of Owls, which I would not put them as a kids show. I mean, I wouldn't put them necessarily as a rated R movie, but it's one of those movies where you really do need to know what you're getting into going into it in the first place.
Thank you two for being on my podcast. You guys offer some wonderful insight. And all seriousness, memeing aside, I appreciate you guys putting up with all of my technical bullshit that occurred during my first 3 takes of this. But, I've run out of time, so I guess I'll have to wrap it up here. Thank you guys for being on the podcast. You guys get 1 minute each for some shameless plug time. We'll start with you, Jake.
Well, you all know by now that I am the co-runner of Green Orcs Gaming, the YouTube channel. Go watch my shit, or I will find you and ask you nicely to do it. Link in the description.
And Drew, anything you need to shamelessly plug for your assigned time?
Well, as someone at some point who watches this video may know, I am the man, the myth, or the man, the meme, the legend, Cheswick. Damn it, Cheswick. But if you'd like to check out some of my stuff, I'm thinking about getting back into YouTube, so it's all older stuff at this point. But Two-Headed Gaming is my channel. It's kind of a mix-mash of stuff at the moment. I've got a little bit of Pokemon speedrunning and just video game Let's Plays in general.
Perfect. And thank you guys for being on my show once again. This has been the Sardonic Podcast. I am your host, Elijah Stubbs Roche, and we'll be back next week where the topic will be coping with being told your waifu is shit.